The grand celestial hall stretched across 3 kilometers of pristine crystalline architecture, a monument to the peaceful coexistence of 743 species that comprise the Galactic Coalition. Today, however, the usual atmosphere of dignified cooperation had given way to something far more unsettling. Ambassador Kelrix of the Vraxian Collective adjusted his translator implant for the 3rd time, still unable to believe what he was hearing. The human delegation sat in their designated section, their faces displaying that peculiar mixture of confusion and pride that Kelrix had come to recognize during his 2 years of diplomatic service alongside Earth's representatives. They didn't understand yet. They couldn't possibly understand what this award truly meant, what it said about their species, their world, their very existence in a galaxy that had suddenly grown very, very afraid. The ceremony had begun like any other annual coalition gathering, with the usual presentations of achievement. The Zephyrians received recognition for their advances in stellar cartography. The Methering Collective accepted commendation for their breakthrough in sustainable fusion technology. Then came the category that no one had expected, the award that had been created in emergency session just 3 rotations prior, voted upon by a coalition of species who had spent the last standard year conducting what they euphemistically called comprehensive analysis of humanity's home world, the most terrifying planet in known space. The presenter, a dignified Carillion whose silver carapace gleamed under the hall's bioluminescent ceiling, had delivered the announcement with a tremor in his vestigial wings that betrayed his species' ancient fear response. Earth, the 3rd planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in the unfashionable arm of the Milky Way galaxy. The birthplace of humanity. The most horrifying world the Galactic Coalition had ever encountered. Ambassador Chenwei stood to accept the award, her dark eyes scanning the assembled delegates with an expression that might have been amusement or might have been warning. Kelrix, who prided himself on understanding human facial expressions, still couldn't quite tell. She held the crystalline trophy, shaped like a spiral galaxy with Earth marked at its center by a pulsing red point, and waited for the polite applause to fade before speaking. Her words would echo through coalition space for generations to come, repeated in training facilities and diplomatic academies, analyzed by xenopsychologists and military strategists alike. "We are honored," she began, and Kelrix detected no irony in her voice, though he suspected it lurked beneath the surface like one of Earth's terrifying predatory fish. "Though I must confess, we find ourselves somewhat surprised by this recognition." Perhaps you could elaborate on the specific criteria that led to Earth receiving this particular distinction? The question hung in the recycled atmosphere of the Grand Hall like a challenge. It was High Counselor Theron of the Wisdom Keepers who rose to respond, his ancient form supported by gravitic assistants, his 3 eyes fixed upon the human ambassador with something approaching pity. What he said next would change everything, would recontextualize humanity's place in the cosmic community, would explain why so many species had begun requesting increased distance from human colonies, why trade agreements were being renegotiated, why the military observers who had visited Earth during their standard integration protocols had returned with detailed reports that sparked emergency sessions across a dozen legislative bodies. "Ambassador Chun," Theron's voice resonated with harmonics that conveyed sorrow and concern in equal measure. "Your world is a crucible of horrors that defies our understanding of planetary habitability. We have explored 16,000 worlds. We have documented life on 7,000 of them. Never, in all our journeys across the stars, have we encountered a planet that seems so fundamentally designed to kill everything that lives upon it, yet somehow instead produces the most resilient, adaptable, and frankly terrifying species we have ever encountered." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ever-present hum of the translation matrix seemed to hold its breath. Ambassador Chen's expression remained neutral, but Kelrix noticed her knuckles whitening slightly as she gripped the podium. She was beginning to understand, he realized, beginning to grasp what the rest of the galaxy had learned over months of careful study and growing horror. Theron continued, his voice heavy with the weight of revelation. Your planet's axial tilt creates seasonal variations that would classify as extreme climate events on most civilized worlds. Your moon, grotesquely large in proportion to your planet, creates tidal forces that generate waves capable of destroying coastal settlements. Your tectonic plates shift and grind against each other with such violence that the resulting earthquakes and volcanic eruptions are measured on scales we reserve for planetary catastrophes. Your atmosphere regularly generates rotating columns of air that achieve speeds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour. Your oceans contain pressure zones that would crush our strongest vessels. Your landmasses are home to predators so efficient that they have remained essentially unchanged for millions of years, because evolution could not improve upon their killing design. The litany of terrors continued, each point punctuated by murmurs of agreement from delegates who had read the reports, who had seen the documentation, who had watched in horrified fascination as researchers compiled the evidence of Earth's fundamental hostility to life. And yet, Theron explained, humans didn't simply survive this world. They thrived upon it. They had conquered every environment it offered, from the frozen poles where water became solid and would shatter lesser beings, to the scorching deserts where surface temperatures exceeded the boiling point of water, to the crushing depths of oceans that should have remained unexplored until civilization developed advanced technology. They had done this without natural armor, without environmental camouflage, without venomous defenses or natural weapons of any meaningful capability. They had done it with intelligence, with cooperation, with something the Coalition was only beginning to understand, an absolutely unbreakable determination not just to survive, but to dominate every challenge their nightmare world presented. The presentation chamber had been converted into what the Coalition called an awareness theater, a space where holographic technology could recreate environments for educational purposes. What Ambassador Chen and the human delegation were about to witness was a compilation prepared by the Coalition's most respected xenobiologists, climatologists, and survival specialists, individuals who had spent their careers studying habitability across the galaxy. Dr. Methelix, a Ceruvian whose species had evolved on a world the Coalition classified as gently moderate in its environmental challenges, stepped forward to begin the presentation. Her voice carried the clinical detachment of a scientist, but Kelrix could detect underlying currents of something else, something that might have been fear or might have been awe. She gestured, and the chamber transformed, recreating the environment of her own homeworld. Rolling plains of purple vegetation swayed under a sky of soft amber. The temperature, she explained, varied by perhaps 15 degrees over the course of their year. Rainfall came in gentle, predictable patterns. The largest predator weighed perhaps 40 kilograms, and hunted in such specialized niches that encountering one required deliberate effort. This, she said, represented the galactic standard, the kind of world that typically produced intelligent life. Then the scene shifted, and suddenly they were standing in what the display identified as the Amazon rainforest on Earth. The temperature spiked immediately, humidity condensing on every surface as the chamber's environmental system struggled to recreate the oppressive atmosphere. Ambassador Chen smiled slightly, recognizing her home continent even in this sanitized recreation. But around her, delegates were gasping, some activating personal shield systems designed for hostile environments, others backing away from the holographic vegetation as though it might attack them. Dr. Methelix's voice had lost some of its clinical detachment. This, she said, represents approximately 6% of Earth's land surface. In this single biome, There exist more species than on all documented worlds in the Theta sector combined. The competition for resources is so intense that evolution has produced what we can only describe as biological warfare. Plants generate toxins deadly enough to kill creatures hundreds of times their size. Insects have evolved to parasitize other insects in ways that would violate our ethical guidelines to even describe fully. Fungi consume living tissue. Bacteria are so aggressive that leaving an open wound exposed for mere minutes can result in life-threatening infection. The scene shifted again, this time to what the humans called Australia. Kelrix watched as several delegates actually left the chamber, unable to process what they were seeing. A spider the size of a dinner plate. Snakes whose venom could kill in minutes. Jellyfish whose tentacles delivered toxins for which there was no natural antidote. A bird, flightless and absurdly proportioned, capable of disemboweling a human with a single kick. Saltwater crocodiles that had survived virtually unchanged since the age of dinosaurs because they had achieved evolutionary perfection in the art of killing. And everywhere, in every ecosystem shown, the casual assumption of lethality, the baseline expectation that nature was not a garden to be tended, but an arena where only the strongest, smartest, and most adaptable survived. Dr. Methelix explained that Australia represented what coalition scientists called a mega-Darwinian environment, a place where selective pressures were so intense that they should have prevented the evolution of complex life forms entirely. Instead, they had produced an ecosystem where even the cute, fuzzy mammals carried enough venom to stop a human heart. But it wasn't just the life that terrified the coalition observers. It was the planet itself, the geological and atmospheric violence that humanity simply accepted as normal. The presentation shifted to show Hurricane Katrina, a storm system so massive that it would have been classified as a planetary-scale disaster on most worlds. The humans, Dr. Methelix noted with something approaching disbelief, had categorized it as merely a Category 5 on a scale that went to 5, implying that such storms, while devastating, were within the expected range of natural phenomena. They had built their cities in the paths of these storms, had developed prediction systems and evacuation protocols, had accepted that every few years their coastal settlements might be partially destroyed and simply rebuilt them. The presentation showed the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, the Lisbon earthquake, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. Each event would have been remembered for millennia on most civilized worlds, would have fundamentally altered their civilization's development, would have driven them to abandon entire regions as cursed or unlucky. Humans had turned Pompeii into a tourist attraction and rebuilt Naples in the shadow of the same volcano. Ambassador Chen finally spoke, her voice cutting through the growing murmur of distress among the delegates. "I think I begin to understand the nature of this award," she said, and now Kelrix could definitely detect amusement in her tone, though it was tempered with something deeper, something like pride mixed with defiance. "You're not honoring our planet's beauty or our civilization's achievements. You're expressing fear. You've looked at Earth, truly looked at it for the first time, and you've realized that the baseline environment that shaped humanity is more hostile than most species encounter even in their worst disasters. And that terrifies you because it means we were forged in conditions you cannot imagine surviving, let alone thriving within." The silence that followed was confirmation enough. Dr. Methelix nodded slowly, her translucent skin shifting through colors that indicated embarrassment and respect. "Yes, Ambassador. That is precisely correct. We have run simulations. If we relocated any of the Coalition's founding species to Earth in their pre-technological state, 97% would face extinction within 3 generations. The remaining 3% would survive only in the most geographically fortunate locations, and their development would be set back millennia." But Chen wasn't finished. She moved to the center of the chamber, her human frame small compared to many of the assembled delegates, but somehow commanding attention through pure force of personality, that particularly human trait the coalition was only beginning to catalog in fear. "What you're really afraid of," she said, and her words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread across the diplomatic assembly, "is not our planet. It's what our planet made us. You're afraid of what kind of species emerges from a world where the atmosphere regularly tries to kill you, where the ground beneath your feet can suddenly crack open and swallow cities, where the water that falls from the sky can arrive with such violence that it strips the paint from vehicles. You're afraid of a species that looked at all of that, at every horrifying challenge Earth presented, and didn't just survive it. We conquered it. We mapped it. We built civilizations in every biome, no matter how hostile. We turned our planet's violence into poetry, into art, into challenges to overcome for recreation." High Counselor Theron rose once more, his ancient form seeming to bear the weight of millennia of accumulated wisdom, and what he said next would become one of the most quoted passages in coalition diplomatic history. "Ambassador Chun, we do not fear your species because of your capacity for violence, though your military history is indeed sobering to review. We do not fear you because of your technology, though your rate of innovation exceeds our models by several orders of magnitude. We fear you because of what your psychologists call normalization of chaos. You grew up on a world where disaster is not an aberration, but a feature of existence, and it has shaped your species into something we struggle to comprehend." He paused, and the chamber's atmospheric processors hummed in the silence, cycling air that suddenly felt heavy with the weight of revelation. Let me provide context through comparison. When the Metheran Collective discovered fire, their homeworld's low oxygen content and damp climate meant that wildfires were virtually impossible. Fire was a tool, controllable and safe when handled properly. When your species discovered fire, your planet's ecosystem responded by producing plants that required fire to reproduce, creating forests that were essentially fuel waiting for ignition. Your wildfires can consume areas larger than some of our member species' entire civilizations, yet humans build homes in these areas, accept the risk, develop suppression technologies, and continue living there. Delegate Kerba of the Peaceful Harmonies, whose species had never known warfare, spoke next, her crystalline voice chiming with distress. "We have reviewed your entertainment media, Ambassador, as part of our cultural integration protocols. What we discovered has troubled our psychological wellness councils deeply. Your species creates fictional scenarios of disaster and survival for amusement. You have entire genres of entertainment based on the premise of your planet trying to kill you, or your civilization collapsing, or extinction-level events occurring. You pay currency to experience simulated versions of trauma that would require therapeutic intervention for most species. You call them disaster movies and survival shows, and you consume them recreationally." She paused, her form shifting through colors that indicated profound confusion. "We had a delegation analyze what you call children's entertainment, assuming it would be gentle and nurturing. We found a film about a fish whose child is kidnapped, forcing the parent to cross an ocean filled with sharks, jellyfish, and other predators. We found stories about young humans lost in forests, fighting for survival. We found narratives where child protagonists face down evil forces that threaten their world. These are not cautionary tales. These are aspirational narratives. You teach your young that the world is dangerous, and that they are expected to be brave enough to face it." Ambassador Chen's expression had shifted to something Kelrix recognized as defensive pride. She glanced at her fellow human delegates, and some unspoken communication passed between them, the kind of wordless understanding that came from shared evolutionary history, shared cultural context, shared experience of growing up on a world that the galaxy now recognized as uniquely terrifying. Counselor Kerba, Chen said carefully, I would like to understand your species' approach to preparing young for adulthood. What stories do you tell your children? The Peaceful Harmony's delegate seemed surprised by the question, but answered readily. We tell them of cooperation, of finding their place in the harmony, of the joy of contributing to collective well-being. We teach them that the world is kind if they are kind to it, that challenges can be overcome through patience and community, that violence is an aberration that occurs only when harmony is disrupted. Chen nodded slowly. And when your children encounter something that doesn't respond to kindness? When patience fails? When the harmony is disrupted by forces beyond their control? The silence that followed was uncomfortable, and Calrix realized that the question had struck at something fundamental, something the coalition species had never truly had to confront. It was Ambassador Torres, Chen's colleague from the South American continent, who spoke next, his voice carrying the rhythms of someone who had grown up in one of Earth's megacities, surrounded by millions of other humans all competing for space and resources. Our children's stories are harsh because our world is harsh. We tell them about fish separated from their families because in our oceans, predation is constant and family bonds are often the only thing that motivates the search and rescue that saves lives. We tell them about children lost in forests because our forests are places where adult humans have died from exposure, from animal attacks, from simply making the wrong turn on what appeared to be a safe path. We tell them about facing evil because human history is full of times when evil wore a human face and only courage stopped it from consuming everything. He stood, his frame muscular in a way that most coalition species found unsettling, the product of a gravity well that was 0.3 standard stronger than the galactic average. We don't tell these stories to traumatize our children. We tell them because the alternative is to send them into the world unprepared for what it will demand of them. The presentation resumed, but now it focused on something that disturbed the coalition even more than Earth's physical dangers, humanity's response to those dangers. Footage played of human children, barely old enough to walk in their planet's heavy gravity, playing in simulation scenarios. The coalition observers watched in horror as parents deliberately placed their offspring in controlled risk situations. Climbing structures that could result in falls, swimming in water deep enough to drown in, playing competitive games that involved physical contact and the risk of injury. Dr. Methelix's voice provided commentary, but it was strained now, pushed to the edge of professional composure. We initially classified this behavior as negligence, possibly even abuse. But further study revealed it to be deliberate socialization. Human children are systematically exposed to risk, failure, pain, and competition from their earliest developmental stages. They are taught that falling is part of learning to climb, that losing is part of learning to compete, that injury is part of learning one's physical limitations. This is so contrary to coalition childcare practices that we struggle to develop appropriate analytical frameworks. The footage shifted to show human adolescents engaged in what they called extreme sports, activities that seemed designed to court death as closely as possible without actually achieving it. Jumping from aircraft and deploying fabric wings to slow their descent. Throwing themselves down mountainsides on narrow boards attached to their feet. Diving into water from heights that would result in impact trauma for most species. Racing vehicles at speeds that exceeded safety parameters by substantial margins. And through it all, the expressions on the young human faces showed not fear but exhilaration, not survival instinct but joy in the challenge. Delegate Meraxis of the Cautious Travelers asked the question many were thinking. Why? Your species has achieved interstellar travel. You have access to virtual reality systems that can simulate any experience without risk. Why do your young continue to seek out genuine physical danger? It was Ambassador Chen who answered, and her words would be analyzed by xenopsychologists for decades. Because virtual danger doesn't actually test us. Because simulation doesn't prove to us what we're capable of. Because somewhere deep in our evolutionary psychology, we need to know that we can survive the fall, win the competition, face the fear, and come through it intact. The session had been ongoing for 6 standard hours, and the initial shock among coalition delegates had evolved into something more complex. A mixture of fear, respect, and dawning understanding of why humanity's integration into galactic civilization had proceeded so differently than previous first contacts. Admiral Vex of the Coalition Defense Fleet, a Rigelian whose species had evolved on a high-gravity world not entirely unlike Earth though far less geologically active, requested permission to address the assembly. His military bearing and scarred carapace marked him as one of the few coalition members who had seen actual combat during the border conflicts in the outer reaches. "I have served alongside human military personnel," he began, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won experience. "I thought I understood them. I was wrong." He activated a tactical display showing an incident from 3 years prior, during a rescue operation in the Kepler debris field. A coalition survey vessel had suffered catastrophic damage and was venting atmosphere, its crew trapped in a section that was slowly spinning toward the gravity well of a gas giant. Standard rescue protocols called for the deployment of automated systems, careful calculation of approach vectors, and priority given to rescuer safety over victim retrieval if the risk exceeded acceptable parameters. The human vessel that responded had ignored every protocol. The recording showed a human pilot manually navigating through a debris field that should have required computer-assisted guidance, threading between fragments of destroyed stations and derelict ships with a precision that seemed to defy physics. When the automated docking systems failed due to the damaged vessel's rotation, 3 humans in pressure suits had physically jumped the gap between ships, using magnetic grapples and their own strength to pull themselves across vacuum and attach emergency stabilizers. They had extracted 17 coalition personnel, carrying them through twisted corridors filled with radiation and explosive decompression hazards, never once hesitating despite injury rates that would have triggered mission abort protocols for any other species. "I asked the human commander afterward," Admiral Vex continued, "why they had taken such risks for people they had never met, members of species they had only known existed for a few years." She looked at me as though the question itself was strange, and said, "Because they needed help, and we could provide it. What else would we do?" The recording shifted to show human disaster response teams during the Proxima Colony crisis, when a cascading life support failure had threatened 12,000 colonists of various species. The Coalition Emergency Response Systems had estimated arrival time at 14 standard hours, which projections showed would be 6 hours too late for approximately 40% of the affected population. The human response fleet had arrived in 9 hours, their crews having pushed their vessels beyond recommended operational parameters, accepting structural stress and system strain that required weeks of repair afterward. They had brought not just rescue equipment, but also the kind of supplies that suggested they had anticipated worst-case scenarios. Medical facilities for treating radiation exposure, psychological counselors for trauma response, engineers capable of rebuilding life support systems from salvage, and most tellingly, body bags and memorial protocols for every coalition species represented in the colony. They had hoped for the best but prepared for the worst, that particularly human dichotomy of optimism and fatalism. Delegate Therones of the Logical Concordance, whose species prided itself on rational analysis uncolored by emotion, presented findings that had troubled their computational councils. "We attempted to model human decision-making under crisis conditions, using historical data from Earth and from human interactions in coalition space. Our analytical frameworks consistently failed to predict human choices because humans employ what we can only describe as controlled irrationality. They make decisions that sacrifice optimal personal outcomes for group benefit. They choose courses of action that have high personal risk but potential for high collective reward. They operate on principles that are not strictly logical, but are deeply rooted in what they call values and ethics, which seem to override pure survival calculus. The logical concordance representative displayed decision trees showing human choices during various crisis scenarios, each one highlighting moments where humans had chosen danger over safety, sacrifice over preservation, action over calculation. From a purely rational standpoint, the Ronis continued, humanity should not have survived. Their evolutionary environment should have produced a species so risk-averse that technological development would be stunted. Instead, it produced a species that seemed to view risk as a puzzle to be solved rather than a warning to be heeded. Ambassador Chen had been listening quietly, letting the coalition members work through their analysis, their fear, their growing understanding. Now she stood again, and Kelrix noticed that the other human delegates were watching her with expressions that suggested they had been waiting for this moment. I think it's time, Chen said, that we address what all of this analysis has been circling around without quite naming. You're not afraid of our planet. You're not even afraid of what our planet made us, not really. You're afraid of what happens when a species forged in chaos encounters a galaxy that has achieved peace through order. You're afraid that we won't fit into your careful structures, your diplomatic protocols, your centuries of accumulated stability. You're afraid that we are, fundamentally, a disruptive force in a system that has learned to value harmony above all else. The truth of her words seemed to resonate through the grand hall, and Kelric saw acknowledgement in the postures and expressions of delegates from dozens of species. You're not entirely wrong to fear that. Chen continued, her voice gentle but firm. We are disruptive. We do question established patterns. We do push boundaries and test limits, and ask why not in situations where the accepted answer has been because this is how it's done for generations. She walked to the center of the chamber, surrounded by holographic displays showing Earth in all its terrifying beauty, storms swirling over oceans, volcanoes painting the sky with ash, tectonic plates grinding against each other in slow-motion violence that would eventually reshape continents. But I would ask you to consider what humanity brings to the coalition that you didn't have before. You have achieved remarkable things through cooperation and careful planning. You have built a civilization spanning thousands of worlds, maintained peace among hundreds of species, created technological and cultural marvels that we are only beginning to understand and appreciate. But you have also, if I may say so, become risk-averse to the point of stagnation. You have optimized for stability so successfully that innovation has slowed, exploration has become conservative, and the spirit of discovery that must have driven your ancestors to the stars has been tempered by millennia of caution. The chamber was absolutely silent now. Every delegate focused on the human ambassador who stood before them, small and fragile-looking by the standards of many species, yet commanding attention through the sheer force of her conviction. We come from chaos. We were shaped by a world that never let us rest, never let us assume safety, never let us believe that we had conquered all challenges. And yes, that made us dangerous. But it also made us adaptable, innovative, and willing to face the unknown, because the unknown is simply what we call Tuesday afternoon on Earth. High Counselor Theron rose one final time, and Kelrix could see that something had shifted in the ancient being's demeanor. The fear was still present, but it had been joined by something else, something that might have been hope or might have been recognition of necessity. Ambassador Chun, your words are provocative, which I suspect is intentional. But they are also accurate in ways that discomfort us precisely because we recognize the truth in them. Yes, the coalition has achieved stability. We have not had a major conflict in 1700 standard years. We have eradicated disease on 97% of member worlds. We have established trading systems and cultural exchange programs that benefit all participants. These are achievements worthy of pride. He paused, his three eyes fixed on the human delegation. But in achieving this stability, we have also created systems that are brittle precisely because they have not been tested by chaos in living memory. When the Kepler incident occurred, our rescue protocols were adequate but not exceptional. When the Proxima crisis unfolded, our response was appropriate but not innovative. We have optimized our civilization for operating within known parameters, and we have lost the capacity to respond effectively to the genuinely unexpected. The admission hung in the recycled air of the Grand Hall, a confession that represented centuries of unexamined assumptions. Delegate after delegate began to speak, some agreeing with Theron's assessment, others arguing for the value of stability over innovation, still others proposing frameworks for how humanity might be integrated into coalition systems without disrupting the careful balance that had been achieved. But it was Delegate Kerba of the Peaceful Harmonies, who had earlier expressed such distress over human children's entertainment, who perhaps articulated the central dilemma most clearly. "We are faced with a choice," she said, her crystalline voice chiming with unusual clarity. "We can attempt to domesticate humanity, to slowly acculturate them to our ways, to teach them to value harmony over challenge, stability over growth. Or we can allow them to retain their essential nature and accept that our civilization will be changed by their presence, hopefully for the better, but possibly in ways we cannot predict or control." She turned to face Ambassador Chen directly. "I confess, the prospect of either path troubles me deeply. But I have been reviewing human cultural materials, and I found a concept that I think may be relevant here. Humans speak of growing pains, the discomfort that accompanies development and change. Perhaps what the coalition needs, after millennia of stability, is precisely such discomfort." Ambassador Torres spoke up, his voice carrying warmth that had been largely absent from the clinical analysis that had dominated the session. "Delegate Kerba, I appreciate your honesty and your willingness to consider uncomfortable possibilities. But I would like to offer a different framework for thinking about this situation. You view humanity as a disruptive force being introduced into a stable system, which is accurate but incomplete. We also view ourselves as students encountering teachers who have mastered things we have barely begun to understand. Your civilizations have achieved peace, cooperation, and prosperity on scales we can hardly imagine. Your technological achievements in fields like medicine, energy production, and environmental management far exceed our own in many areas. We have much to learn from you, and we are eager to do so." He smiled, and Calrix was struck again by how much meaning humans could convey through the simple manipulation of facial muscles. "What we're proposing is not that you become more like us, but rather that we learn from each other. You can teach us harmony, patience, and sustainable civilization building. We can perhaps remind you of what it feels like to venture into the unknown, to take calculated risks, to believe that the next discovery might change everything." The debate continued for hours more, with delegates proposing various frameworks for human integration, from quarantine protocols that would limit human cultural influence to accelerated integration programs that would place humans in every coalition institution and system. But gradually, a consensus began to emerge around a principle that Ambassador Chen articulated as the session moved toward conclusion. "We propose," she said, "a partnership of complementary strengths rather than a relationship of teacher and student or of threat and containment. The coalition has mastered the arts of peace and cooperation. Humanity has been forged by chaos and challenge into a species that excels at adaptation and innovation. These are not opposing principles, but complementary capabilities that, combined, could create something unprecedented in galactic history. A civilization that maintains peace and harmony while also retaining the capacity for growth, change, and response to the unexpected. She held up the crystal trophy that had sparked this entire discussion, the award for most terrifying planet, and Carrick saw that she was smiling now, not with amusement, but with genuine warmth. We accept this award, not as an insult, but as recognition of something important. Earth is a terrifying world by your standards. It made us into a terrifying species by those same standards. But perhaps what the galaxy needs right now is not more harmony, but the right kind of controlled chaos. The vote, when it came, was not unanimous. 17 species abstained, unwilling to commit to a path that seemed to invite disruption into carefully balanced systems. 23 species voted against full integration, proposing instead various compromise positions that would limit human influence while still benefiting from human capabilities. But 307 species voted in favor of what became known as the Complementary Partnership Protocol, a framework that would allow human civilization to maintain its essential character while integrating into coalition systems. The protocol established exchange programs that would place humans in coalition institutions and coalition members in human systems, created joint research initiatives that would combine coalition stability with human innovation, and most significantly, designated humanity as the coalition's primary rapid response force for crisis situations that required unconventional thinking and high-risk action. As the vote concluded and delegates began to file out of the Grand Hall, Carrick approached Ambassador Chen, his curiosity finally overcoming his diplomatic reserve. "May I ask you a personal question, Ambassador?" Chen nodded, her expression open and friendly. "When you heard that Earth had been named the most terrifying planet, what was your first reaction?" "Truly?" Chen considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Honestly? Pride. Not because I think it's good that our planet is so dangerous, but because surviving Earth made us who we are. Every human who reaches adulthood has survived challenges that would kill most coalition citizens before their 10th year. We've earned our place in the galaxy, not despite our terrifying world, but because of it." The chamber was nearly empty now, just a few delegates lingering to discuss the day's revelations. Earth rotated on holographic displays, blue and white and green, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Carrick looked at it and tried to imagine growing up on such a world, tried to picture himself as a child learning to swim in water that could drown him, climbing structures he could fall from, competing in games he might lose. The image wouldn't quite form. His own childhood had been safe, nurturing, carefully structured to minimize risk and maximize development. It had produced a functional adult, a successful diplomat, a member of a species that had thrived for millennia. But watching the humans prepare to leave the Grand Hall, seeing the way they moved with confidence born of surviving a world that had tried to kill them every day of their lives, Carrick wondered if safety had a cost that his species had paid without even realizing it. Perhaps the most terrifying thing about Earth wasn't the planet itself, but what it revealed about the rest of the galaxy, that in seeking to eliminate danger, they had also eliminated something essential, some capacity for growth and adaptation that only challenge could provide. The humans were leaving now, ambassadors of chaos in an ordered galaxy, representatives of a world that had forged them in fire and storm and geological violence. They would change the coalition, Carrick knew. They already had, simply by existing, by showing what was possible when a species refused to accept limits, when they looked at a planet designed to kill them and decided instead to thrive. As Ambassador Chen reached the doorway, she turned back one final time, catching Carrick's eye across the vast chamber. She smiled, and in that smile was everything that made humanity both terrifying and necessary: courage, defiance, hope, and an unshakable belief that the next challenge, whatever it might be, could be overcome. "Thank you, Counselor Kelrix," she called across the distance, "for the award, for the honesty, and for being willing to take the risk of letting us in. We won't let you down." And with that, the human delegation departed, leaving Kelrix alone in the grand hall with a holographic display of Earth rotating slowly in the darkness, a reminder that somewhere in the galaxy there was a world so terrifying that it had produced the most resilient species known to exist. The coalition had survived for millennia through caution and cooperation. Now, it would learn whether it could thrive by embracing the controlled chaos that humanity represented. The age of perfect stability was ending. The age of complementary partnership was beginning. And the galaxy, Kelrix realized with a mixture of fear and excitement that he had never expected to feel again, was about to become a far more interesting place. The trophy sat on a pedestal, crystalline and perfect, marking Earth as the most terrifying planet in known space. But Kelrix, looking at it in the empty chamber, realized that the award meant something different than what its creators had intended. It wasn't a warning. It was a recognition that terror and beauty could coexist, that the most challenging environments produced the most remarkable outcomes, that safety and growth existed in tension with each other, and that perhaps, after millennia of choosing safety, the galaxy was finally ready to choose growth again. Earth had won the award. But perhaps, Kelrix thought as he deactivated the holographic display and prepared to leave the grand hall, it was the coalition that had won the real prize. A chance to remember what it felt like to be truly alive, to face genuine challenges, to reach for the stars not because it was safe, but because it was worth doing. The humans called it the spirit of exploration. The coalition called it terrifying. Both, Kelrix suspected, were correct.